Recognizing Oak Bay, Gordon Head.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to rise and stand and speak in support of Bill 20, Medicare Protection Amendment Act 2019. This bill enables the elimination of the regressive approach to MSP premiums in the province of British Columbia. I'd like to start, Honourable Speaker, by correcting history, because history is often overlooked. A lot of people are trying to take credit for what's going on with MSP reform today. Let me tell you that MSPs were introduced in British Columbia in 1968. 1968. That's 51 years ago. Successive Socred governments, Liberal governments, NDP governments have come and gone, and each and every government has done nothing to eliminate MSPs. Not once. It wasn't until the mid-2000s that this regressive approach, was turned into a form of indirect taxation through the BC Liberals, a one-size-fit-all approach to taxations. In essence, a head tax that led to a myriad issues. This issue became front and center in British Columbia in January of 2015, an issue that the BC Green Party brought to the legislature in January of 2015 with a call for the elimination of MSPs. Both the official opposition at the time and the government at the time will recall I introduced a petition with 65,721 signatures on it that was put together by Michelle Coulter from Ucluelet. I introduced another petition of about 7,000 names who contacted the BC Green Party. I also proposed at that time an alternate means of actually eliminating the MSP that maintained the revenue. And it was at that time that overwhelming public support started pressuring the BC Liberal government at the time, and the NDP opposition jumped on. So as people reflect upon this historic event today, I would suggest to them that they should look no further than the influence of the BC Green Caucus on government policy to get us to the elimination of MSPs, when as a single MLA sitting in this House in 2015, 2016, we as a group turned this into a provincial election issue and had people fighting over themselves, trying to determine who would eliminate it the first. And I say that again with sincerity and by pointing to the history. 1968 was when we introduced MSPs premiums in British Columbia. The very progressive Barrett government of the 1970s didn't touch MSP premiums. The Liberal and Socred governments thereafter didn't touch an increase. I daren't even say this because I'm so sick and tired of hearing about the 1990s, but nevertheless, in the 1990s, another NDP government didn't eliminate MSP premiums. Those last 16 years that we've heard so often didn't eliminate MSP premiums. But I would suggest that it was in those last 16 years that actually public pressure and public concern rose. And the reason why is people started to recognize that this was tax creep. It was tax creep happening in a truly regressive fashion, in a one-size-fits-all fashion. Whether you earned $3 million a year or $30,000 a year, you were paying the same premium. What we proposed, what the BC Greens proposed in 2015, was a different way of looking at the funding of the premium, a funding that mirrored what goes on now presently in Ontario. While we applaud that government has eliminated MSPs, we would not have done it this way. We would not have done it this way because the way government has chosen is to singularly pass that cost on through an employer health premium. Now, I recognize and we support the notion that there was room to grow the employer health premium in British Columbia, as we were by far the lowest employer health premium in terms of employee paying in the country, the payroll tax in essence. However, the approach we took is we believe that it's important to place a value on a service, but that value should actually reflect your ability to pay. And so we had proposed a measure that followed and mirrored what is done in Ontario, where each and every person in Ontario has an item called an Ontario healthcare premium. And that's a progressive amount, much akin to what we see in employment insurance and Canada Pension Plan. You have a third line, and it's called Ontario Health Premium, which for low income is precisely $0. And if you earn over $200,900, I think it is, you pay something like $900 a year, a progressive amount. So there is a value to the healthcare service. There's a small cost based on your ability to pay, which ensures then that revenue comes in, but in a progressive fashion. That was our approach. That was an approach that would have actually not led to the double dipping situation we have for this single fiscal year. It's an approach that would have also recognized that across British Columbia, there are many collective agreements where the signing of those agreements has actually included costed benefits, which is the employer paying the medical service premium. That's a costed settlement against an agreement that a union, a collective bargaining unit, has actually costed against a salary settlement. Now, unfortunately, through the elimination of the MSP premium, what has happened is that costed settlement against past settlements is now vaporized. So those benefits, which were accrued and negotiated away by unions from north to south and east to west, they now can look back and say to their union members, we have lost that ability to negotiate for that $1,000 or whatever dollars a year that was coming off. I'm actually quite shocked that the NDP decided to choose this approach, because they have thrown under the bus, in essence, every single member of a labor union in the province of British Columbia that had a negotiated settlement that included the medical service premium being costed against that settlement in terms of the actual past negotiations. That's in essence something like $1,000 that has come off each worker's costed rights. The unions in British Columbia should be up in arms over the NDP approach, because now that costed benefit has vaporized. So those previous salary settlements could have had that extra amount that was costed to pay the premium added to salary and other benefits. I'm surprised, honestly. I'm surprised that we haven't heard protests from the unions. Well, maybe not in light of some of the other, maybe in some of the other kind of things we've seen in areas where there's been given, but that to me is quite remarkable. So that approach, that progressive approach, would have avoided many of the problems that we see with the implementation, particularly for this year. It is this year that there's a problem with the double dipping. It would have recognized the costed settlements that were in place with existing collective agreements, and it would have respected that amount moving forward by allowing members who gave up that money, gave up that in a negotiation, the right to have that come back to their actual negotiated package. You know, in 2001 and 2002, the BC Liberals rose the MSP premium something like 50%, and then they froze it for 6 years. And then again in 2009 and 2010, they started to increase it again, 4 to 5% each year until 2015. And by 2017, all categories of MSP premiums, individuals, families of two, families of more than two, had doubled since the BC Liberals took office in 2001. And that started to create dissent within the broader public in British Columbia. Dissent that there was an unfairness, which is why we had so much support for this initiative that we took on in 2015. As I mentioned, 65,721 signatures on a petition put forward by Michelle Coultier that I brought to this legislature, and I believe I introduced that in 2016. It was an issue that I know there wasn't a single MLA in this room that did not receive many thousands of emails from chain emails across the province. And I'm glad that government today and the opposition at the time in the election campaign and the Greens, we were all climbing over ourselves to say who would eliminate MSP premiums first. I don't think, and in fact, one of the moments in the leaders' debate, in the 2017 leaders' debate, I thought was quite a fine moment from my perspective, selfishly he says, when I asked the now Premier, I said, so let me get this right in your campaigning for MSPs. What's your plan? You have a plan to develop a plan to come up with a plan. That was the NDP approach, and he agreed, remarkably. And in fact, the plan, one of the plans to develop a plan, to come up with a plan, was to create a committee, an MSP task force. So government actually put such a committee together before the budget last year, and then decided that government knew best exactly how it was going to move forward with the elimination of the MSP, despite the fact that the committee had yet to actually return their reports. And so while the committee was talking about a variety of measures and metrics and ways that the revenue could be replaced, whether it be through a sugar tax or whether it be through a small employer health tax or whether it be through a healthcare premium, government decided to go its own way and decided to go 100% with the healthcare premium. That's government's prerogative and government's choice. As I say again, I'm surprised that there wasn't uproar within the union movement in this province, because I can tell every single union member in this province that has had historically MSP premiums paid by their employers, they've just lost out $1,000 plus, at least, for each and every one of them from a negotiated previous cost of settlement against what they were owed and deserved, because that was costed against their settlement. It's actually quite remarkable the government has gone this way. And yes, I know this full well because I have acted as chief negotiator twice in bargaining agreements where we actually have costed our MSP premiums against a negotiated settlement. So yes, I know that this to be true, Honourable Speaker. With that said, I do applaud the fact that we are indeed moving towards the elimination of MSP. The co-benefits that are not often talked about is that there's an entire bureaucratic structure that is no longer needed. There are literally tens of thousands of, maybe even hundreds of thousands of letters that are emailed every month saying this is what your MSP premium for this month will be. If you think about 100,000 letters going out at $1 a letter, that's $100,000 a month for a start. But it's much, much more than that. We also know that there is a very serious problem in terms of collecting of long-term debts that have been accrued in the MSP premium. Part of it is unknowing debt. There are those who can't pay, but there are also those very egregious examples out there where people have gone away and not realized that they apparently owed MSP, and they come back to rather large bills. And I'll give you an example, real-world examples. A student might be working in British Columbia for one summer after graduating from high school. Say they graduate from high school in June, they attend their convocation, they work through the months of July and August, they might have a union job, they might actually in a union job where they look at their paycheck and they realize that as part of their employment, the employer was paying MSP. So they go and take their job, that's their first job straight out of high school, they see that the employer is paying the MSP, but they don't really know what that is, and then they decide that they're going to go to Europe for college. So they go to Europe for 4 years. They leave the province of British Columbia. They may go to France or Britain or Germany or Sweden or Norway, attend a college there for 4 years, and then perhaps they might want to come back to Victoria or Vancouver and work in British Columbia. Well, guess what? The second they come back to British Columbia, they get a bill. They get a bill for 4 years of MSP premiums plus accrued interests because they did not opt out of MSP when they left the country to go to these other jurisdictions for which they were 100% covered by the local jurisdiction. Whether you're a student in England, you're covered. If you're a student in other jurisdictions across Europe, you're covered. But you're expected to continue to pay here unless you physically opt out. Now, the number of people who physically opt out has been so small, you could almost count it on a hand because people didn't know they had to do that. The number of people who had these outrageous bills presented to them upon their return is huge. And therein lies the problem. We know that what happens is a young person, and there are many examples of this, will come back from abroad, they'll get the bill, and they have a choice to pay. Do they pay this bill that they think they owe, even though they weren't eligible, or they may have been eligible, they didn't use or even know they did, or do they not? And in many cases, they don't. And what happens then is collection agencies start to come after them. And so then they have a credit rating. They're starting off in their life. They may have worked for one summer in a union job. Didn't know that that company that was paying for them actually was paying the MSP. They come back 4 years later, they get a bill for thousands and thousands of dollars. They don't go, what's this about? And then the collection agent comes after them, and then and on it goes. That's no longer going to be the case. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing because we don't need those collection agencies. We have a lot of debt on the books that is going to have to be forgiven, I suspect, or collected in some other means. But at least we're moving forward and beyond this. So again, coming back to this was a campaign issue from the BC Liberals. They didn't want to be left out. 50% cut they planned. When the BC NDP ran, they campaigned to eliminate. They didn't really articulate how, because frankly, I don't think they actually figured it out, because their plan was to develop a plan, to come up with a plan, and the plan was going to be first developed by a committee that was developing a plan that they ignored. So they staggered their way through, and they decided to come through with this employer health tax approach. And that's their prerogative. And we understand that. And we recognize that they are government, and they have these choices to make. And while we support the overall notion of MSP being reformed, we don't believe that that was the appropriate way to go in its entirety. A small component, yes. The BC NDP campaign on cutting MSP, and they initially did it by 50%. In actual fact, what they did was basically leave in place the BC Liberal budget, which had already reduced it by 50%. And then they had promised to move on to the entire elimination, which is where we are right now. The first step of the MSP premium, reducing by 50%, happened in Budget 2018, and here we are now moving forward with the completion through this tax. Again, when I look at this, we've had a platform issue even in 2013, going back to that, the history. 2013, we were calling on the elimination. It actually was formally put forward repeatedly in 2015 and 2016. And as I stated, I'm very, very pleased that we're actually at this position now. Overall, and in conclusions, since 2015, we've outlined a number of aggressive natures. One of the things that we've outlined as well, and I hope the Minister of Health takes note, is that right now we're penalized in British Columbia for being a destination of choice for elderly Canadians. And why I say that is we know it's very simple to calculate the amount of money that is spent on health care and weight that as a function of age. We know that the average age in British Columbia is lower than the average age in other provinces. We know that the Federal Canada Health Transfer is based on the number of people, with no age weighting to that number of people. So we know when you do a simple weighted average, because we know how much health care money is spent as a function of age, we know it increases exponentially towards the latter years of your life. We know that when you take the age profile of a province and you weight the Canada Health Transfer by that age profile, that BC is short something of the order of $200 million of Canada Health Transfer money that should be coming to us based on an age-related approach. We know that people in British Columbia may work in the oil sands in Alberta during their younger years. They may be paying taxes in Alberta, provincial taxes in Alberta. They may be working in the Hibernian fields. They may be working in a factory in Ontario. And then in the latter stages of their life, they may choose to come back and live in a place where there's no snow in the winter. And where is that place? That place is often Vancouver Island. So we know this is going on in Canada, and that is the beauty of this great nation that we have, is we allow people to freely go from east to west and north to south. And that we encourage people to come here, and we have a long history of being a home. In fact, Victoria, when I've grown up here, I don't know whether it's still called, but it certainly was called this when I was a younger person, as the city of newlyweds and nearly deads. And I'm one of those few people who has moved from the age of like newlywed to nearly dead. There are not many of us out here, but I am. Maybe I'm the member from Chilliwack, Kent, suggesting I'm speaking too soon. I hope so. I hope so. But certainly I've watched the growth of this town over the last 57 years, and my goodness, it has grown, and it's grown to become more diversified. It's quite exciting. But coming back to that Canada Health Transfer, I sincerely hope that we do have the pressure being put on the federal government to reflect upon the nature of the Canada Health Transfer and the unfairness of people paying their taxes in other provinces and then retiring in British Columbia, and I would suggest that it is entirely defensible to argue that the Canada Health Transfer should be weighted by age, based on the amount of healthcare spending we do as a function of age, and I've done the calculation. And $200 million, we could use that. I'm sure the minister could use $200 million. We could fund all sorts of drugs like Orkambi, for example. I'm just joking. But we could. $200 million is nothing to sneeze at. So this is something that I hope we'll encourage. Anyway, with that said, I do commend the Minister of Health. I mean that sincerely. We in British Columbia are very lucky and fortunate to have a minister who goes so deep on files and is truly committed to this file. We've seen some very good things happen in this province. This is one of them. Again, I don't necessarily like the way the funds are being replaced, but I do certainly have full confidence in the Minister of Health, direction he's taking this province healthcare. And with that, I'll take my place and thank him for his good work.